Hey guys, tonight we begin with Explore, unearthing the secrets of Pompeii, life before the eruption. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you tuning in from and what time is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You know what's really hard? Getting up in the morning. Harder still is getting up in the morning after having had your entire city destroyed by an angry volcano. But that is exactly what happened to the citizens of Pompeii. And you can learn all about their struggle for survival from the safety of your bed right now. It's 79 AD, and you are living the sweet life in Pompeii. You might be a merchant looking forward to unloading your wares at the market, or maybe you a gladiator gearing up for a day of murder in the Colosseum. Or perhaps you just a chill civilian minding your own business and getting yourself ready for a lovely mid-morning snooze before getting back to the business of being a Roman dude. Well, whatever your plans for the day are, unfortunately, they're gonna have to wait, because today is actually the day Mount Vesuvius erupts. It's unclear what exactly woke you up that fateful morning. Maybe it was the ground rumbling beneath your feet as the magma chamber below Vesuvius released some of its pent-up pressure in the form of an earthquake. Maybe it was the ash falling from the sky like snow, covering your house and blocking out the sun. Or maybe it was your neighbor, Stabius Secundio, whose house has conveniently caught fire because the earthquake also managed to rupture some gas lines. In any case, you are awake and you are confused. Why does the sky look like that? Where did all the birds go? And why is it suddenly so dark? Are we having a really early eclipse? All these questions and more will unfortunately go unanswered, because now it's time to run for your life. Luckily, if you were paying attention when the earthquake hit, you probably realized that the coast was clear. There wasn't much danger of a tsunami, so the people closest to the sea could safely make their way inland to higher ground. For everyone else, the danger of lava flows would quickly become apparent. The safest place to go was north, away from the mountain, but with no roads and few buildings tall enough to take cover from falling ash. Your best bet was probably to find a cave to hide in. But with little time to spare, you grabbed whatever you could and ran. As you fled, you passed by the Forum, the center of social and commercial activity in Pompeii. Here, you could have made one of two fatal decisions. You could stay behind with your possessions and hope for the best, or you could grab your stuff and try to get out of town. If you chose to stay behind, well, sorry, but you're not making it. If you chose to leave, then congratulations. You've just successfully looted a bunch of shops, and now you're rich. What are you gonna get with your ill-gotten gains? A new tunic, maybe a fancy chariot. How about a sweet pet monkey? No? Okay. Well, how about a new house? Yeah, that sounds nice. Too bad you don't have much time to enjoy it before you die. The lucky thing is that there is a house for sale right here in this very forum. It's got central air conditioning, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a swimming pool, and a rooftop garden with stunning views of Mount Vesuvius. Just imagine waking up in the morning, brewing yourself a fresh cup of locally roasted coffee, stepping out onto the balcony and breathing in the crisp air while admiring the majestic snow-capped peak in the distance. That sounds relaxing. Too bad you never got to, because you're dead. In order to get out of the city, you would have had to pass through one of the 4 gates that surrounded the city walls. Now, most people assume that these gates would have been a bottleneck for the fleeing populace and a choke point for the deadly pyroclastic surges that followed. But recent excavations have revealed that this isn't entirely true. While the Porta Marina gate nearest to the volcano was indeed buried in volcanic debris, the other 3 gates were found to be free of obstructions, suggesting that they remained open during the eruption. These gates were normally kept closed at night to keep out bandits, but during the day they were left open for trade. So it seems that the people of Pompeii did indeed have several options for escape, but most chose to stay and fight another day. What could you possibly have been thinking? Leaving aside the roughly 20% of buildings in the city that were destroyed in the earthquake, the vast majority of Pompeii was still intact. In fact, the city was still largely intact when Mount Vesuvius unleashed its full fury. As the pyroclastic surge swept through Pompeii, it reached temperatures of over 230 degrees Celsius, hot enough to burn flesh off bones. Only those who had managed to escape the city or hide in a cave or underground chamber survived. The trouble was, while you may have managed to survive the initial blast, you didn't manage to survive the fallout. Ash fell on Pompeii for days after the initial eruption. To make matters worse, strong winds blew much of it over 100 kilometers away, blanketing an area of over 2,000 square kilometers. After a while, the ash started to settle, and the people of Pompeii began to emerge from their caves. But what they saw before them was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The whole city was covered in ash. Homes were destroyed. Businesses were ruined. Even the mighty Vesuvius itself seemed strangely subdued. The once proud peak was now just a smoldering pile of rubble. But the worst part was that the ash contained extremely fine particles of pulverized rock and pumice. When disturbed, these particles were extremely dangerous to breathe in. Anyone who survived the initial blast probably didn't survive this second one. But even if somehow you did, you soon discovered that you were pretty much alone. Up to 16,000 people perished in Pompeii, most from suffocation rather than burning. Entire families were found huddled together in their final moments, desperately seeking fresh air as the suffocating ash filled their lungs. Some people died standing, others died kneeling, but all of them died terrified. After days of total darkness, the wind finally shifted and people began to emerge from their hiding places. They stumbled out into the total devastation around them and surveyed the damage. Many of them were shocked to find that their homes were still standing. But inside those homes were scenes of unimaginable horror. Corpse bags lay strewn across the floor. Jewelry boxes had been ransacked, and valuables of all kinds were strewn across the ground. People searched frantically for food and water, but there was none to be found. The supply trucks that had been due to arrive that day had been canceled because of the eruption. Those who didn't flee had starved to death. So you might be asking yourself, what now? What happens next? If you've been hiding in a cave, you're probably wondering how you can safely re-emerge without getting killed by toxic fumes or falling masonry. If you're outside the city, you might be wondering where you can find food, water, or shelter. If you're wandering around the city, you might be wondering where the heck everybody went. But whatever your concerns may be, the good news is that the people of Pompeii were well prepared for such an emergency. Pompeii was built to last. Its sturdy buildings and strong infrastructure meant that it was able to withstand earthquakes and other natural disasters that might befall it. In addition to its physical resilience, Pompeii also had a highly developed culture of preparedness. Its citizens took steps to ensure that they were ready for anything, whether it was stockpiling food and water or planning evacuation routes in the event of an emergency. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, it unleashed a force of nature that was unlike anything Pompeii's citizens had ever experienced before. But despite the ferocity of the eruption, the city and its people were able to endure. The buildings stood strong against the collapsing mountain, and the citizens were able to evacuate the city without mass panic or gridlock. And so, dear listener, you survived the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but your ordeal is far from over. Did you know that one of the most famous cities in history was once a very normal place to live? Pompeii was an ordinary Roman city, living its best life. It had all the things any other city would have: markets, shops, public baths, brothels, bars, restaurants, even fast food places. The citizens of Pompeii were not cut off from the rest of the empire. In fact, they were quite connected to the outside world. A road ran right through the center of the city, connecting it to the neighboring cities of Stabia and Nola. If you wanted to go further afield, there were two sets of roads leading to Naples, one via the coastal road and another through the hills. Even though the roads were bumpy, dirty, and full of potholes, merchants still traveled them regularly, and the local government even saw fit to pave them with small stones to make travel a bit more comfortable. The paved roads were lit up at night so travelers could navigate them easily after sunset. Along these roads were also built milestones indicating distances to various locations. This made planning trips a lot easier. There was even a schedule of sorts for merchant ships sailing between Pompeii and the Greek colony of Cumae, which was located south of Pompeii across the Bay of Naples. These ships typically sailed early in the morning and arrived at their destination by noon, giving travelers plenty of time to get where they needed to go. Once they reached the port, travelers could choose to walk or take a horse or donkey to get to the city. There was even a parking lot of sorts where travelers could leave their vehicles. So if you needed to get somewhere fast, you could always hire a horse. Just make sure you had some cash on hand to pay the driver. The marketplace was one of the busiest areas in Pompeii. People came from all over to buy fresh produce, spices, and other goods. The market was also a great place to meet friends and catch up on the latest gossip. You never knew who you might run into while shopping for your weekly supplies. If you needed a haircut or a shave, you could visit one of the many barber shops in Pompeii. It wasn't just men who got haircuts. Women and children could also be seen getting their hair done at the barber shop. Sometimes the whole family would come together for a haircut. Barbershops were also a great place to socialize and catch up on the latest news. So it was unusual for people to spend hours chatting with friends and neighbors while getting their hair cut. The barbershops in Pompeii were typically small, dark, and crowded. There wasn't much room for privacy, so customers often had to share stories about their love lives or personal problems with the entire shop listening. But despite the cramped conditions, the people of Pompeii wouldn't have traded their bustling shops for the world. One of the most popular spots in Pompeii was the bar at the corner of the two main streets. It was here that people would come to relax and enjoy a drink after a hard day's work. The bar was also a great place to meet new people and catch up on the latest gossip. There were all kinds of different bars in Pompeii. Some were small and family-run. Others were larger establishments with live music and dancing. No matter what type of bar you were looking for, you were sure to find it in Pompeii. People drank a variety of different beverages in Pompeii. Wine was the most popular, but beer and cider were also common. The local specialty was a type of wine that grew in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. It was said to have a unique flavor that was unlike any other wine in the empire. People would come from all over to taste this special wine. The people of Pompeii also enjoyed eating out at restaurants. There were all kinds of different eateries in the city, serving everything from pizza to seafood. One of the most popular spots was the restaurant at the Gladiator School. It was said that the food here was amazing and the company even better. After all, you never knew which gladiator might be sitting at the next table. Now imagine this, you strolling down the street when suddenly your attention is drawn to the sound of singing and drums. You turn toward the noise and see a group of men dressed as hairy wild men beating on shields and clashing swords. They're accompanied by a few women who are dressed as priestesses and holding long white staffs. As the procession moves forward, they begin to chant and dance. Their movements are wild and unrestrained, and you can't help but feel a sense of excitement and anticipation. This isn't just a street performance. It's a religious ceremony. These men are gladiators, and they're on their way to the local amphitheater to compete in a mock battle. The crowd cheers and screams as the gladiators clash swords and shields. The atmosphere is electric, and you find yourself on the edge of your seat as the battle reaches its climax. But then, suddenly, one of the gladiators collapses. He's been struck by a sword and is bleeding profusely. The crowd gasps and falls silent as the injured gladiator is carried away. The celebration has turned into a tragedy, and you can't help but feel a sense of sadness and disappointment. Theaters were a big part of life in Pompeii. People of all ages would attend performances, and the shows were often very entertaining. The Pompeii Theater was one of the largest and most elaborate in the region. It could seat up to 5,000 spectators and featured a stage that extended far out into the audience. The theater was used for all kinds of performances, including tragedies, comedies, and even musical reviews. The acoustics were amazing, and the sightlines were excellent. So no matter where you sat, you could see and hear everything clearly. The people of Pompeii loved attending shows at the theater, and it was one of the most popular places for entertainment in the city. Whether you were in the mood for a laugh or a good cry, the theater had something for everyone. And with its convenient location in the city center, it was easy to catch a performance, no matter what your schedule. The theater was also a great place to meet new people and catch up with old friends. The shows were so popular that people would often attend them with their families and friends. During the performances, the audience would talk and socialize, and it was not uncommon for people to make new friends at the theater. The Forum was the center of social, political, and commercial life in Pompeii. It was a place where people from all walks of life came together to discuss the issues of the day, trade goods and services, and simply enjoy the company of others. The Forum was surrounded by a series of colonnaded buildings that provided shade and shelter from the elements. This made it a comfortable place to spend time, whether you were engaging in business deals or just relaxing with friends. The Forum was also home to a number of statues and monuments that celebrated the city's history and its greatest citizens. These served as reminders of the achievements of those who had come before and inspired the people of Pompeii to strive for greatness themselves. But life in Pompeii was not just about work and entertainment. The city was also home to a number of important religious sites. The Temple of Jupiter was one of the most important religious buildings in the city. It was dedicated to the king of the gods and was believed to be a powerful symbol of the city's prosperity and well-being. The temple was a major center of activity for the cult of Jupiter and was visited by pilgrims from all over the empire. Another important religious site in Pompeii was the Shrine of the Lares, which was located in the Forum. The Lares were the household gods of the Romans and were believed to protect the city from harm. The shrine was decorated with offerings to the Lares and was a reminder of the importance of family and community in Roman life. So what did daily life look like in Pompeii? For the average citizen, daily life in Pompeii was likely quite similar to daily life in other Roman cities. The people of Pompeii were ordinary Romans going about their everyday lives. They woke up early, ate breakfast, and then went to work. Men typically worked as merchants, artisans, or laborers, while women managed the household and took care of children. The people of Pompeii were proud of their city and its accomplishments. They decorated their homes with frescoes and sculptures celebrating the city's history and its greatest citizens. They also participated in civic life and held offices in the city government. The people of Pompeii were also devout Romans, and many of them belonged to the cult of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, which was the official state religion of Rome. They worshipped other gods as well, including the Lares, who were the household gods of the Romans, and the Genius, who was the spirit of the Roman people. The people of Pompeii also celebrated Roman holidays and festivals, such as the Ludi Romani, which was a week-long festival held in honor of the founding of Rome. Overall, the people of Pompeii were just regular folks trying to live their lives and make the best of the situation. They worked hard, played hard, and worshipped their gods. They were proud to be Roman, and they were proud to call Pompeii their home. Pompeii was a prosperous Roman city until an enormous volcanic eruption swallowed it whole. The ancient city has been the subject of numerous books and films, the most famous being the 1997 movie starring Kit Harington and Lindsay Duncan. But how much of this portrayal is true? Pompeii was a very normal Roman city in many ways. It had large public buildings, streets, and even running water. Much like any other Roman city, it also had its fair share of problems, such as a very real fear of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Located just 24 kilometers from the volcano, the citizens of Pompeii were intimately aware of its presence and the potential threat it posed. A small group of wise men, known as augurs, monitored the volcano daily for signs of unrest. They looked for smoke, changes in its shape, and even the trembling of the earth. These men performed rituals to keep the volcano calm and appeased. However, their efforts would prove futile. On the morning of August 24th, AD 79, the people of Pompeii awoke to a clear, cloudless sky and went about their daily business. Little did they know that in just a few hours, their lives would change forever. Around noon, the augurs noticed that a thin plume of smoke was rising from the summit of Mount Vesuvius. Though unsettling, this was not particularly unusual, and the citizens largely ignored it. Throughout history, there had been several false alarms when it came to Vesuvius. In fact, another eruption had occurred in 62 AD. The people of Pompeii had even incorporated these events into their mythology, believing that the smoke represented the breath of a giant named Vulcan, who lived inside the mountain with his wife, the goddess of the hearth, Vesta. As the day wore on, however, the smoke began to thicken and darken. It was now clear that something was wrong. Despite this, the people of Pompeii continued with their daily activities, which included attending the amphitheater to watch the mock battles between gladiators. Gladiators were men who fought to the death or to capture in the arenas of Roman amphitheaters. They often came from two backgrounds. Some were volunteers, usually former prisoners, while others were slaves. Slaves could be owned by anyone and were usually bought at auctions, where owners would pay a premium for well-trained fighters. Many gladiators died during battles, but those who survived would live out the remainder of their lives as commoners. The construction of the Pompeii amphitheater is thought to have begun around 70 BC, and it is believed to have inspired the design of the Colosseum in Rome. This oval amphitheater had 3 stories and was surrounded by columns, statues, and decorations depicting scenes from Greek mythology. When it was completed, it could hold up to 20,000 spectators. In the 1st century AD, the amphitheater hosted armed combat between gladiators, fights between pairs of wild animals, and executions. Some of the popular types of gladiators were the murmulator, a heavily armed foot soldier, the retiarius, a net fighter, the hoplomachus, a highly skilled swordsman, and the threx, a gladiator from Thrace, known for his skill with a sword and shield. As the evening progressed, the blood-soaked sand of the arena was replaced by actors and actresses performing scenes from Greek tragedies and Roman comedies. Pompeii's theater was constructed around 100 BC and was designed to hold about 5,000 spectators. During its early years, the performances consisted of tragedies and Greek and Roman myths. Later, farces and satires were also performed. These plays often dealt with contemporary issues and frequently mocked influential members of society. The use of satire to lampoon public figures continues to this day and can be seen in shows like South Park and Family Guy. But unlike those shows, the satire of Pompeii had real consequences. The actors would occasionally name prominent citizens in their skits, which would then become the target of public derision. Around 80 BC, the Roman playwright Caelius Rufus wrote a play called The Dolls of Pompeii, set in Greece. The comedy told the story of 2 sets of twin brothers who were separated at birth. One set was raised by a poor farmer, and the other grew up in a palace. The play caused a riot among the audience. The twins from the palace were played by 2 actors named Amos and Roscius, who were rivals in real life. Their animosity toward one another was so great that it spilled over into the performance and distracted the audience. The rivalry eventually culminated in violence when Amos struck Roscius across the face with a wooden sword. After the show, each actor blamed the other for the riot, and the bickering became so heated that it required the attention of Roman soldiers. In addition to the theater and amphitheater, Pompeii had other public entertainment areas, including a forum, several temples, gardens, an outdoor market, and brothels. The forum was the center of public life, serving as a marketplace and the site of political activity. Each full Roman citizen could vote and participate in local government. The wealthy elite held most of the power, and the majority of the assemblies were dominated by them. The voting assemblies were composed of 5 main groups. There were the patricians, the oldest and most established families, the optimates, the rich landowning class, the equites, the wealthiest merchants and businessmen, the plebeians, common folk, and the lowest social class, the proletarians. During the last century, before the eruption, Pompeii experienced a building boom. New forums, temples and private homes were constructed, many of which had frescoes and artwork depicting scenes from Roman mythology. Pompeii was also home to one of the largest artificial pools in the ancient world. Built by the wealthy property owner Gaius Vibius Pansa, it was thought to have been used for swimming races and diving competitions. Pompeii boasted excellent public baths, which were more than just a place for cleansing oneself. They were social hubs where patrons could relax, socialize, and conduct business. The baths consisted of a series of rooms of varying temperatures to prepare the body for maximum relaxation. The frigidarium was the coldest room, followed by the tepidarium. Next was the caldarium, the hottest room, which was also where the socializing took place. Once fully relaxed, patrons would cover themselves with oil and scrape it off to remove dead skin. This process was not only a form of exfoliation, but it was also a method of hair removal. Though Pompeii had many benefits, it was also a bustling commercial hub with a large harbor. The goods brought in through the seaport were stored in warehouses until they could be distributed throughout the province. Unfortunately, evidence suggests that the harbor had become somewhat polluted due to waste and sewage being dumped into the water. Despite all the luxuries of Pompeii, life was not perfect. Archaeological evidence indicates that prostitution was present, as was widespread gambling. The brothels of Pompeii were businesses much like any other and were subject to taxes and inspections. Prostitution was tolerated in Roman society, and prostitutes were even employed by the military to help soldiers relax during their downtime. Gambling was considered immoral by the Romans, but it was still widely practiced. At the gambling houses of Pompeii, men wagered their money on dice games. Some of the dice were loaded, leading to allegations of cheating. Life in Pompeii ended abruptly on October 25th, AD 79, the previous day. The augurs had recorded an intense earthquake, but no tremors were felt in the city. However, a small amount of ash had fallen from the sky. On the morning of the 25th, the smoke rising from Vesuvius had become so thick that people were afraid to even leave their homes. By midday, the air was filled with pumice stones, hot cinders, and volcanic ash. People desperately ran for the hills, but after a few hours, the ash reached a depth of several feet, and it was impossible to breathe. Within a few days, the volcano had completely buried Pompeii. Pompeii was a prosperous Roman city located near Mount Vesuvius. At the time, it was home to around 11,000 people. It was also known as one of the most desirable places to live in the Roman Empire because of its warm climate and beautiful architecture. However, this all changed when Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79 AD. The eruption lasted for 2 days and covered the entire city with ash. It is estimated that around 2,000 people lost their lives during this horrific event. Because of the speed of the disaster, many were caught off guard and were unable to escape the deadly eruption. Although Pompeii had been buried under a thick layer of ash, the site remained undiscovered until 1748. Since then, excavations have revealed many interesting artifacts from daily life in Pompeii. However, archaeologists are still uncovering new information about the lives of the people who lived there. Recently, archaeologists discovered an ancient wall painting depicting the goddess Minerva. It was found inside a luxurious villa in Pompeii and dates back to around 60 BC. This means it was painted nearly 2,400 years ago. Experts believe that Minerva represented wisdom and crafts, and that the painting may have been intended to protect the villa from harm. It was painted in the fourth style of Pompeian mural painting, which was popular between 50 BC and 50 AD. The painting was so well preserved that archaeologists could even see the cracks in the paint that formed over the centuries. Incredibly, it's thought that the painting's vibrant colors would have originally popped much more and contained a level of detail that we wouldn't be able to imagine today. But what else have archaeologists found at the site of Pompeii recently? Keep watching to find out more. Life in the Roman Empire is often portrayed in films as being dirty and unpleasant. However, this couldn't have been further from the truth for the wealthy inhabitants of Pompeii. They had access to clean water that flowed through lead pipes into their homes. In fact, every house in Pompeii had access to running water. However, it's worth noting that pipes made from lead would eventually cause poisoning, so it's unlikely that the water was safe to drink in the long term. Houses also featured indoor toilets that were connected to sewer systems, meaning that waste could be flushed away. For those without toilets in their own homes, public bathrooms were available throughout the city. These were usually located next to public baths, which were important community spaces in the Roman world. Speaking of baths, what would you say was the favorite pastime of the citizens of Pompeii? If you said relaxing in the hot tubs, then you'd be correct. The Forum Baths was one of the most important public buildings in the city. Here, people would come together to socialize, bathe, and relax. The baths were first built in 180 BC and were completely free for everyone to use. The complex consisted of cold, warm, and hot rooms, and it was here that people would spend hours talking to friends and catching up on the latest news. After spending time in the baths, people would cover themselves in oil and scrape it off to remove dirt and dead skin. The oil was then saved and used for cleaning. Sometime in the future, you might want to visit the ruins of Pompeii for yourself. You can explore the excavated site and see what life was like 2,000 years ago. There are also several museums nearby where you can view artifacts that were found at the site. Even though the city was destroyed in a horrible natural disaster, it is still one of the most fascinating places to learn about ancient Roman life. During the excavations, archaeologists found a coin dated 63 AD. This would have been around 16 years before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. It was found at the Stabia Gate, which was one of the main entrances to the city. Coins like these were usually used by merchants or traveling salespeople, as they didn't have access to banks or credit cards. Each coin would have had a different value depending on its size and composition. The coin would have been slightly larger than a modern US dime and would have been worth approximately 4 modern cents. When the coin was first discovered, it was assumed that it had been dropped by someone who was trying to flee the city. However, after further examination, experts realized that the coin had actually been deliberately lodged in the mortar of the gate. Some believe that this was done as an offering to the gods, or maybe as a way to ward off evil spirits. Others think that the person who placed the coin was making a statement against a particular politician or emperor. Regardless of who put the coin there and why, it remains an intriguing artifact from life in Pompeii. The excavations have revealed a lot of information about the diet of the people who lived in Pompeii. It's believed that wheat was the staple food in the Roman world, and that it was ground into flour and used to make bread. The flour was also used to make a type of porridge called polenta. Vegetables were also popular in Pompeii and included figs, olives, peppers, and chickpeas. Fruit was typically only eaten during the summer months and included grapes, pomegranates, and dates. Meat was typically reserved for special occasions, but goat, sheep, and pork were commonly eaten animals. In addition to meat, fish was also popular in Pompeii since the city was located near the coast. Seafood could be caught fresh and added to meals. It's believed that seafood was especially popular among the upper classes. In general, the people of Pompeii ate a relatively healthy diet that consisted of fresh produce, seafood, and lean meats. Of course, there was also wine, which was an important part of Roman culture. The quality of life in Pompeii was high, and this is reflected in the types of food that the people ate. Unlike some other cities in the Roman world, Pompeii was not subject to food shortages or famine, meaning that there was always a plentiful supply of food available. This was due in part to the city's location near the coast and its fertile soil. This allowed the people of Pompeii to grow their own crops and raise livestock. In addition, the city's proximity to the sea meant that fresh seafood was always available. All of this contributed to the high quality of life in Pompeii, and its citizens enjoyed a diet that was both nutritious and delicious. One of the most well-known aspects of Roman culture is its art. Some of the most famous pieces of Roman art were created during the rule of Augustus. Augustus was the first emperor of Rome, and he reigned from 27 BC until his death in 14 AD. During his reign, Rome experienced a golden age of peace and prosperity, which was reflected in the art that was produced. Much of the art from this period was highly idealized and focused on themes of victory, power, and glory. This was intended to glorify Augustus and the Roman Empire as a whole. Some of the most famous pieces of art from this period include the Augustus of Prima Porta and the Era Passus Augusta. Both of these works are highly polished and showcase the wealth and power of the Roman Empire. Aside from official art, there was also a thriving black market for art in Pompeii. For example, there was once an illicitly excavated fresco of the Greek goddess Athena that was sold to a private collector. However, the forgery was soon uncovered, and the artwork was confiscated by the Italian government. Forgeries like these were common in Pompeii and other parts of the Roman world. Archaeologists have also found counterfeit coins and other items that were made to look like authentic artifacts. This was done in order to deceive unsuspecting tourists or collectors. Counterfeit items like these were usually lower quality and less valuable than authentic artifacts. However, they were still in demand because of the allure of owning something from ancient Pompeii. When Pompeii was destroyed by a volcano, it was already struggling to survive. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD buried the Roman city in ash and pumice, killing thousands and ending the lives of many animals. It's one of the most famous disasters in history and has inspired books, films, and TV shows. But new excavations are constantly uncovering more about life in Pompeii before the disaster. And some of the findings show that the city had a lot of problems even before the volcano erupted. Here is a look at 7 things Pompeii residents ate before the volcano struck. 1. Fruit. There is evidence of fruit being grown in Pompeii through the discovery of seeds found in different layers of the ruins. An article from Live Science revealed that seeds have been found in Pompeii's ruins belonging to apples, pears, figs, grapes, pomegranates, and more. Excavations suggest that they were brought into the city for sale or eaten by the inhabitants. Evidence suggests that while poorer people ate their fruit fresh, richer people preferred to preserve theirs. Jars containing preserved fruit have been discovered throughout the excavations. They were created by placing the fruit in jars and covering them with a wax seal. This ensured that the fruit would be preserved and could be enjoyed much later. The majority of these preserved fruits were grape-based products, such as wine and vinegar. But peaches, pomegranates, and other fruits have also been discovered. 2. Bread. Grain was an important part of the diet for the ancient Romans. The remains of wheat and barley have been discovered in Pompeii, proving that bread was a common food source. The items were found during excavations in the Forum, which was the central marketplace in the city. Archaeologists believe the grains were brought into the city via boats along the coast and then sold to local bakers who would turn them into bread. In addition to the grain remains, archaeologists also found fragments of loaves of bread. These were discovered in a bakery near the city's Forum, still stuck in their molds. While archaeologists were unable to determine the exact recipe used by the bakers, they did learn that they were likely creating large loaves of bread, similar to today's faugas bread. In modern times, this type of bread is often sold in round or oval shapes, but in those days, they only had access to certain tools and therefore would bake the bread in long, narrow shapes. 3. Fish. Because of its proximity to the coast, it's not surprising that fish played a large role in the diets of Pompeii's residents. Fragments of fish bones have been discovered throughout the city's excavations, indicating that fish was not only common in their diet, but was also consumed in large quantities. This was made possible by the establishment of a school of fish at the nearby Stabian Bay. This school of fish helped to make sure that there was always a plentiful supply of fish for the locals to eat. Additionally, coins bearing the image of a fish have been found, further demonstrating how intertwined fishing was with the culture of Pompeii. One of the coins depicts a type of fish called a sea bream. It was likely minted after an abundance of the fish showed up in the nets of local fishermen. For meat played an important part in the diet of the wealthy Romans in Pompeii. Bones of cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs have been found in the city's ruins. However, meat was generally avoided by poorer people. Instead, they would eat cheaper meat alternatives, such as the eggs and honey from bees. Pigs were kept in large numbers by the Pompeians, and their remains have been found in various locations around the city. Most of these discoveries have been made in the southwestern region of Pompeii, where archaeologists believe pigs were raised for slaughter. Many of these pigs were killed and consumed during religious festivals. Evidence of this was found when archaeologists uncovered the remains of a pig that had been sacrificed alongside a bronze altar dedicated to a fertility goddess. 5. Slaves. The tradition of eating slaves was common throughout the Roman Empire. However, it was most popular among the upper classes, who often hosted feasts, inviting other wealthy citizens. During these gatherings, it was common for them to serve up a dish made from small birds stuffed with dormice, which were commonly enslaved. A fresco depicting two women preparing a banquet was discovered in Pompeii, showing a scene that might have taken place before one of these lavish parties. One of the women is holding a cage full of dormice, which she is preparing to stuff with spices, herbs, and other small delicacies. The process was considered so satisfying that many Romans wrote poems and songs celebrating it. So it's quite possible that this meal would have been served to guests at banquets hosted in Pompeii. 6. Mushrooms. While excavating Pompeii, archaeologists discovered a mural showing two women picking mushrooms. This suggested that the inhabitants of Pompeii enjoyed eating mushrooms just as many people do today. Mushrooms were usually picked and then in olive oil, salt and vinegar, and were considered a delicacy reserved for special occasions. However, it should be noted that not all mushrooms were safe to consume, and eating the wrong ones could result in hallucinations or even death. The women shown in the mural were likely picking Amanita caesarea mushrooms, also known as Caesar's mushrooms. These were considered the most delicious and were highly sought after. The women would have most likely picked the mushrooms and then sent them off to be prepared for consumption. 7. Exotic foods. Thanks to its location in the Mediterranean and extensive trade routes, Pompeii had access to exotic foods from across the world. Many of these foods were brought in from Egypt, Asia Minor, and North Africa. Olive oil from Africa, linen and papyrus from Egypt, and garum, a fermented fish sauce from Asia Minor, were just some of the imports making their way to Pompeii. Garum was particularly popular and was often used as a condiment or flavoring for other foods. It's believed that it may have even played a role in preserving the fruit found in the sealed jars. Life in Pompeii was not easy. Besides food shortages and famines, the city also suffered from public riots and rebellions. A revolt broke out in 59 BC after the governor raised taxes. The rebellion was led by a former gladiator named Lentulus, who was able to recruit a following thanks to his fame from the games. After he was eventually captured, the governor decided to use him as an example to scare the rest of the population back into submission. He was crucified along with his followers, and their bodies were left to rot in the forum. To add insult to injury, the governor chained Lentulus' head to the chariot that had been gifted to him by the Senate and paraded it through the streets. Pompeii was buried in ash and pumice during the 79 AD eruption of Mount Vesuvius. For centuries, its ruins lay undiscovered beneath the soil until excavations began in the 18th century. With each passing year, archaeologists unearth new secrets about life in this ancient Roman city, and the latest discovery has revealed how even after 2,000 years, it's still possible to find something completely unexpected. The year is 79 AD, and it's another scorching summer day in Pompeii. You are making your way through the crowds that fill the forum, the bustling center of town where merchants hawk their wares and politicians debate the latest controversies. The bleating of sheep in the marketplace and the raucous laughter of gladiators practicing in the nearby amphitheater. It's just an ordinary day in one of the most prosperous cities in the Roman Empire. But as you make your way through the forum, you notice some people who stand out from the crowd. They are dressed in fine clothes, their sandals are made of leather instead of wood, and they carry themselves with an air of superiority. These are the elite of Pompeian society, the wealthy landowners and merchants who have made their fortunes in trade or inherited it from their families. They own vast estates in the surrounding countryside where they grow crops like olives, figs, and grapes. The wealth of the elite class is built on the backs of thousands of slaves who toil in the fields and workshops without rights or protections. Many of these slaves have been captured in wars or bought from slave traders, and their lives are brutal and short. A former slave has a chance to start a new life in Rome. But, as we all know, life in ancient Rome wasn't easy. Competition was fierce, and there were few opportunities for advancement. However, there was a growing number of freedmen who had become rich in trade. In ancient Rome, there was a growing demand for luxury goods and services. freedmen were well positioned to take advantage of this trend, as they were familiar with the tastes and preferences of the elite and had the skills to produce high-quality goods. Additionally, freedmen were often highly motivated to succeed, as they were eager to prove themselves capable and trustworthy. This was because many freedmen faced discrimination and prejudice from Roman society, which viewed them as inferior and untrustworthy. As a result, freedmen were often compelled to excel in their chosen fields in order to gain respect and recognition. Moreover, freedmen had a unique understanding of both the elite and the common people. This gave them an advantage in business, as they were able to cater to the needs and desires of both groups. Many freedmen went into business for themselves, setting up shops, restaurants, and other establishments that catered to the elite. Some freedmen also became artisans, producing high-quality goods that were in demand among the wealthy. Others became merchants, traveling throughout the empire to buy and sell goods. In fact, a recent discovery in Pompeii has shed light on the lives of these freedmen. Archaeologists unearthed a house that once belonged to a wealthy merchant named Marcus Furius Bibaclus. What makes this house unique is that it was owned by a freedman who had become incredibly wealthy through trade. The house is filled with artifacts that tell the story of Bibaculus's rise to wealth, including mosaics depicting scenes from Greek mythology. Record of a transaction between Bibaculus and one of his freedmen. The inscription reveals that Bibaculus was so wealthy that he could afford to gift his freedmen with a considerable amount of money. However, the garden in Bibaculus's house is unlike any other in Pompeii. It is filled with exotic plants and flowers from around the world, including palm trees, citrus trees, and flowers from Egypt and India. This suggests that Bibaculus had traveled extensively and brought back souvenirs from his journeys. He was not only a successful merchant, but also a cultured individual with an appreciation for art and beauty. However, not everyone in Pompeian society was as fortunate. While the elite class enjoyed the fruits of their labor, the lives of the common people were far from easy. Many were trapped in poverty and had little access to basic necessities such as food and clothing. The common people of Pompeii were mostly poor and uneducated, working long hours for low wages as laborers, shopkeepers, or artisans. Life was hard and the future looked bleak. The looming presence of Mount Vesuvius was a constant reminder of the fragility of their existence. Yet, despite the hardships they faced, the common people of Pompeii were resilient and resourceful. They formed tight-knit communities where neighbors helped each other out and shared what little they had. They also found ways to make their lives more bearable, such as by participating in religious festivals and cheering on their favorite gladiators at the amphitheater. On the fateful day of the eruption, it was the common people who suffered the most. When the ash and pumice rained down on Pompeii, they were caught off guard and had nowhere to turn. The elite class, however, were able to flee the city and escape the wrath of Vesuvius. Even after 2 millennia, Pompeii continues to captivate us with its secrets. The discovery of the house of a freedman who had become wealthy through trade reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for a better future. Imagine stepping back in time 2,000 years ago to the bustling streets of Pompeii. Now you find yourself in this ancient town where life is vibrant and the future seems limitless. But wait, there's a twist. You have the extraordinary ability to see the ghosts of those who once called this place home. You witness their everyday lives, their joys and sorrows, their hopes and dreams. it's like reliving history firsthand. But then a change comes over the town. A new emperor takes power, and the town's character begins to shift. Are they a sign of progress, or something more sinister? In today's video, metropolis, known for its grand architecture, vibrant culture, and bustling population. However, recent archaeological findings suggest that the town had undergone significant changes in the years leading up to its demise. These changes were not just superficial, but went deep into the very fabric of Pompeian society, shaping its character in ways that we are only beginning to understand. This is nowhere more evident than in the Forum, the heart of public life in the city. The Forum was a complex web of streets and buildings that housed government offices, shops, and other civic institutions. Here, the grandeur of Roman architecture was on full display, with soaring arches, intricate marble floors, and statuesque public buildings. However, as we walk through the Forum today, we also see signs of the city's older character. For example, the Temple of Apollo, one of the oldest temples in the city, still stands here alongside newer structures, serving as a reminder of Pompeii's rich history. The mixture of old and new buildings wasn't just a reflection of the city's age, but also a deliberate effort to preserve its heritage while embracing new ideas. This is particularly evident in the Stabian Baths, one of the best preserved bathhouses in Pompeii. The baths were a central part of Roman public life, and this particular complex was a masterpiece of Pompeian engineering and design. The baths were built in the 1st century BC, but were later renovated in the 2nd century, incorporating new features such as a heated swimming pool and a frescoed ceiling. This blending of old and new was a common theme in Pompeian architecture, and it reflected a city that was both forward-looking and deeply rooted in its traditions. But it's not just the buildings themselves that tell the story of Pompeii's changing character. The artifacts found within them also provide valuable insights into the daily life of the city. Some frescoes depict scenes from Greek mythology, while others show everyday activities such as cooking or gardening. By studying these frescoes, archaeologists have been able to learn about the Pompeians' religious beliefs, social customs, and even their sense of humor. Another fascinating aspect of Pompeian life is the street art that can be found throughout the city. Graffiti, election posters, and even crudely drawn phalluses adorn many of Pompeii's walls, providing a glimpse into the city's social and political life. These graffiti range from the mundane to the scandalous, and they reflect a city that was alive with activity and debate. In fact, some of the graffiti is so politically charged that it would be considered subversive by today's standards. These writings offer a window into the sometimes contentious relationship between the people of Pompeii and their rulers. The amphitheater was a major center of entertainment in Pompeii, and it hosted a variety of events, including gladiatorial combats, animal hunts, and theatrical performances. The amphitheater's design was innovative for its time, and it was one of the earliest structures in Rome to feature an orchestra pit and a system of arches and vaults that allowed for a large roofed seating area, including the construction of new seating areas and the installation of decorative fountains and statues. These changes were likely intended to make the amphitheater more attractive to spectators and to enhance the prestige of the city. But perhaps the most dramatic example of Pompeii's changing character can be seen in the city's houses. Some houses were modest affairs with simple rooms and courtyards, while others were veritable palaces with frescoed walls, mosaic floors, and elaborate gardens. One of the most famous examples of a Pompeian house is the Villa of the Mysteries, a large country house on the outskirts of the city. The villa was once owned by a wealthy Roman senator, and it is named for the mysterious initiation scenes that are depicted in its fresco. However, the villa was not static, but rather evolved over time, incorporating new architectural features and decorative elements as the city itself changed. It was not only the physical character of Pompeii that was in flux during the final years of the city, but also its social and political character. Pompeii was located in a region that was known for its agriculture, and the city's economy was largely based on farming. However, in the years leading up to the eruption, the city's agricultural production began to decline due to a combination of factors, including soil erosion and volcanic activity. This decline had a profound impact on the city's economy and society, and it contributed to the construction of new buildings and the renovation of existing ones. The decline in agriculture also coincided with a period of political instability in Rome, which may have exacerbated the economic crisis in Pompeii. In 62 AD, a powerful earthquake struck the region, causing widespread damage in Pompeii and other cities. Moreover, the earthquake may have contributed to the decline of agriculture in the region, making it more difficult for people to make a living in Pompeii. Despite these challenges, the people of Pompeii were not passive in the face of adversity. While the renovation of existing buildings helped to stimulate the economy by bringing in new merchants and craftsmen, in addition to the earthquake, there were other factors that may have contributed to the changes in Pompeii's character. For example, the city's population may have been growing, putting pressure on its housing supply and creating a need for new buildings. Additionally, the city's leaders may have been trying to improve Pompeii's image and prestige by investing in new public works projects. In conclusion, the changes in Pompeii's character that occurred in the years leading up to its destruction were a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. While the city was certainly shaped by external factors such as earthquakes and volcanic activity, the people of Pompeii were not passive in the face of adversity. They took steps to try to improve their economic situation and to make their city more prosperous. These efforts resulted in a city that was in a constant state of flux, with new buildings going up and old buildings being torn down and replaced. This process created a unique urban environment that was unlike any other in the ancient world. Unfortunately, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius put an end to Pompeii's story, but the city's legacy lives on in the ruins that have been remarkably preserved for centuries. Pompeii was a bustling Roman city, but it was also a community of real people with real relationships, dreams, and worries. But what was life like in Pompeii? How did the citizens spend their time, and what kind of community had been built there? Let's find out. It all began with Julius Caesar. In 49 BC, he made the decision to cross the Rubicon River, beginning a civil war that would see him eventually crowned dictator of the Roman world. This civil war would end with the establishment of the Roman Empire, and at its center would be the great city of Rome. But as we now know, Rome wasn't the only city in the empire. Pompeii was also a part of this growing empire, located about 14 miles or 23 kilometers from Naples in what is now Italy. It was a thriving metropolis known for its art, culture, and trade. At its peak, it was home to around 11,000 people, not including slaves. They lived in large apartment complexes called insulae, some up to 5 stories high, made of stone and concrete. These buildings were crowded, but they were a familiar sight throughout the Roman world. The architecture mirrored that of Rome itself. And as we know, Rome wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a place where people lived and loved and died. Pompeii was no different. But what evidence do we have of these people's lives? Well, their houses can tell us a lot. Archaeologists have uncovered well-preserved homes that are full of fascinating details, such as frescoes on the walls depicting scenes from mythology, small gardens filled with fountains and statues, and even food still sitting in the kitchen. Pompeii was a vibrant, colorful place that bustled with activity day and night. It may have been a smaller city, but it shared many similarities with Rome. But let's take a closer look at one of the most important aspects of Roman life: their public spaces. Pompeii boasted impressive public buildings, including temples, theaters, and baths, just like Rome. And these places weren't just for the rich and powerful. They were open to everyone, creating a sense of community and belonging. In fact, the Forum, which was the center of public life, was modeled after the Forum in Rome. It was a place where people could buy and sell goods, meet friends, and discuss politics. The Forum in Pompeii was surrounded by government buildings, shops, and cafes, making it a hub of activity. People from all walks of life gathered here to exchange ideas and participate in civic life. It was a microcosm of Rome itself. But it wasn't just the physical spaces that brought Pompeii and Rome together. It was also the cultural ties between the two cities. Pompeii was deeply connected to Rome through trade, communication, and cultural exchange. The city was situated along an important trade route, allowing it to exchange goods and ideas with other cities throughout the empire. This trade brought wealth and prosperity to Pompeii, which used the profits to fund public works projects and support the arts. As a result, Pompeii became a center of commerce and culture, much like Rome. But what does this tell us about the people of Pompeii? What was their everyday life like? To understand the everyday life of the people of Pompeii, we need to explore their work and leisure activities. Pompeii was a diverse city with people from all walks of life. There were merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, and farmers. The economy was driven by agriculture, with vineyards, olive groves, and orchards providing food and wine for the population. The city was also home to a number of wealthy landowners who owned large estates in the surrounding countryside. These landowners often employed slaves to work their land, while the free population worked as artisans and merchants. The streets of Pompeii were bustling with activity as people went about their daily business. Merchants sold their wares in small shops and stalls, while artisans crafted goods in their workshops. The city was a hub of economic activity, with merchants from all over the empire coming to trade. This economic prosperity created a thriving middle class that enjoyed a high standard of living. They could afford to purchase luxury goods, such as fine clothing and jewelry, and they participated in public life by serving in local government. But life in Pompeii wasn't just about work. The people of Pompeii also valued leisure and entertainment. They enjoyed watching theatrical performances in the city's amphitheater, which could seat up to 5,000 spectators. They also held festivals and games in honor of the Roman gods and goddesses. These public events brought the community together and created a sense of shared identity. People from all social classes could come together to celebrate and enjoy themselves. This sense of community was fostered by the city's public spaces, such as the Forum and the public baths. The baths were a central part of Roman culture and were a place where people could socialize and relax. They were also used for exercise and hygiene, as the Romans believed that cleanliness was important for both the body and the soul. But what about the people of Pompeii? How did they feel about being a part of the Roman Empire? For the most part, the people of Pompeii were loyal subjects of Rome and were proud to be a part of the empire. They benefited from the stability and prosperity that Rome provided, and they felt a sense of security, knowing that they were protected by the Roman military. However, there were some who resented the growing influence of Rome. They feared that the Roman customs and culture were eroding their traditional way of life. This tension between tradition and modernity was a common theme in Roman society, and it was particularly evident in the cities that were on the outskirts of the empire. As we continue our exploration of Pompeii, it's important to remember that the people who lived there were real individuals with hopes, dreams, and fears. They were not just victims of a natural disaster. Pompeii was a city that was deeply connected to Rome through trade, communication, and cultural exchange. Its residents were proud Roman citizens who enjoyed the benefits of the empire. They participated in public life, supported the arts, and valued leisure and entertainment. While some may have resented the growing influence of Rome, the majority of Pompeians were loyal subjects who appreciated the stability and prosperity that the empire provided. Over the last few decades, archaeologists have unearthed an array of interesting objects from the ruins of Pompeii, a Roman city buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. Some of these finds include beautifully preserved frescoes, jewelry, skeletons, and even mummies. But other artifacts are raising more questions than answers, like a small statue of the Egyptian god of the dead found in the ruins. And this is just one of many that suggests the city had strong ties to Egypt long before it was destroyed. New episodes every week. Like any other Roman city, its inhabitants were exposed to the ideas and customs of neighboring cultures through trade and travel. In fact, excavations suggest that many merchants and artisans from Greece, Egypt, and Asia lived in the city, bringing elements of their culture with them. One of these cultural imports was the worship of strange gods and goddesses, some of which were considered foreign deities. Although the Romans created their own myths and legends, they readily incorporated stories and beliefs from neighboring cultures. This can be seen in the way that the Greeks adopted the Egyptian goddess Isis as one of their own. It's likely that something similar happened in Pompeii. The first piece of evidence pointing to the city's Egyptian connections is a small statue of Anubis. It was found in a house in the central part of the city, suggesting that the owner was probably wealthy since space in the house was limited. The statue may have been used in rituals or placed there simply as a reminder of the owner's devotion to the Egyptian deity. This isn't the only example either. Other statues and artifacts depicting Egyptian gods have been found throughout the city. These finds suggest that Egyptians weren't just visiting Pompeii, but that many of its residents actively participated in religious practices of the foreign land. But what could have motivated them to do so? Well, the answer might lie in the teachings of the cult of Isis, one of the most popular cults in the Roman world. It was dedicated to the Egyptian goddess of magic and healing. According to Roman sources, the cult started spreading around the 1st century BC, although it's possible that it arrived earlier. There's evidence that the cult had a strong following in Pompeii. including a temple and a priestess who initiated new members into the faith. Unfortunately, not much is known about the rituals performed in the cult. What made the cult so appealing to the Romans was Isis's connection to the afterlife. Unlike the traditional Roman religion, which focused primarily on pleasing the gods to prevent them from causing harm, the cult of Isis offered its followers a way to reach paradise after death, since they were the ones with the most to gain from an afterlife in paradise. The lower classes would have found comfort in the promise of a better life after death. But why would the elite risk their status by practicing an outlawed religion? It turns out that they too wanted a piece of paradise. But unlike the lower classes, they didn't need help reaching it. In fact, they believed they could buy their way in. These findings provided valuable insight into how the cult operated in Pompeii, but also revealed its true purpose. It turns out that the cult wasn't just a gateway to paradise. It was a money laundering operation. High-ranking members used their influence to defraud unsuspecting worshippers, promising they would help them reach paradise if they paid a hefty price. To make matters worse, these secret societies often operated in taverns, brothels, and gambling houses, places where people were most vulnerable to being taken advantage of. Although the cult of Isis had a dark side, it was still appealing to many Romans, including the elite. For example, the Emperor Augustus' wife, Livia Drusilla, converted to the religion and helped spread its popularity. She even built a temple dedicated to Isis in her honor, which suggests that the goddess was seen as a powerful and influential figure. But not everyone was happy with the growing popularity of the cult. This raises the question, how did the statue end up in a Roman house? One possibility is that it was brought there as a souvenir by someone who visited Egypt. After all, the Roman army frequently marched through Egypt during this time period, and many soldiers likely took mementos home with them. It's also possible that the statue was smuggled into the city by a member of the cult. If that's true, then it means that the practitioners of the cult were willing to take great risks to bring pieces of Egypt to Pompeii. They may have done this because they believed that having even a small piece of Egyptian soil would increase their chances of reaching paradise. Or they may have simply wanted to show off their wealth and power by owning something so exotic. Whatever the reason, the presence of Anubis in Pompeii suggests that the city had strong ties to Egypt long before it was destroyed. In fact, it's possible that the city's destruction was actually caused by an earthquake that struck Egypt at the same time. If that's true, then the two events are more closely connected than we ever imagined. As you can see, the story of Pompeii is full of twists and turns. What seemed like a simple excavation turned into a journey through the mysteries of ancient Egypt. From the discovery of Anubis to the frescoes of the Villa of the Mysteries. But perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from this ancient city is that no matter how powerful or influential a civilization is, it's always vulnerable to the forces of nature and the dangers of religious fanaticism. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the rise of the cult of Isis are two examples of how even the mightiest civilizations can be brought to their knees. Pompeii was destroyed by an eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 AD, and since then, people have been uncovering artifacts from this ancient city which help us to better understand what life was like for the people who lived there. One of the most popular items that have been found are these little clay cups called kyliks. But today we're not going to be talking about those. Instead, we're going to talk about something much larger: Pompeii wine. Did you know that before Prohibition, it was legal to transport alcohol across state lines? During the time of the Roman Empire, winemaking was a major industry, and it was especially important in the region surrounding Naples. The volcanic soil created wines that were in high demand all over the empire. It was so important that archaeologists have found lots of evidence for winemaking here. They've found entire vineyards, along with presses and storage areas, where they would store their product. In fact, one of the most exciting recent discoveries at Pompeii was this large wine press that was uncovered during excavations in 2022. So today, we're going to take a closer look at some of the evidence for Pompeii wine, including this new press. We'll also talk about some of the vessels they use to store their wines, known as amphorae. And we will do our best to answer the question: why is it that Pompeii produced such high-quality wine? The first thing we need to understand is how wine was made in the ancient world. You may think of wine as something bubbly and fun, but the process of creating it was actually quite laborious and took advantage of gravity, pressure, and time. To make wine, the first step is to pick the grapes and then crush them. This would have been done by foot in the ancient world, as evidenced by the many fresco paintings that depict this part of the process. Once crushed, the liquid would be pressed out of the mixture and collected in some sort of container. Then it was stored until it could be sold. This is where the invention of the wine press comes into play. Wine presses were used to extract the liquid from the crushed grapes. Without something like a juicer or other modern technology, the only way to separate the juice from the seeds and skins of the grapes was to put the crushed grapes into a press and apply pressure. And that's exactly what this press was used for. Wine presses come in all different shapes and sizes, but they all work on the same principle. Here you can see the central screw mechanism of the press. As the screw is rotated, it applies pressure to a large flat surface, forcing the liquid out of the grapes. This press was made of wood and stone and was too large to be moved once it was constructed. So instead, it would be set up in a permanent building. In fact, this particular press dates to around 50 BC, making it over 100 years older than the destruction of Pompeii. The press was discovered in an area where several large buildings were found, including a symmetrical complex that may have been used for commercial purposes. This included shops and warehouses. So this press may have been used to produce wine on a large scale. What's so interesting about this press is that it's the first one to be discovered at Pompeii. Other presses have been found throughout the region, but this is the first one found within the city itself. It was buried under several layers of ash and debris during the eruption, which preserved it until it was discovered by archaeologists in 2022. It's such an exciting find because it helps us to better understand how wine production worked in the ancient world. But now we need to figure out what they actually did with all that wine once it was made. And that brings us to our next piece of evidence: these large storage jars, called amphoras. Amphorae were the ancient world's equivalent of cans and plastic jugs. They come in all different shapes and sizes, but all have two handles and a narrow neck. This made it easy for them to stack on top of one another without falling over. These are just a few examples of amphorae that were found at Pompeii. They were typically made of clay, but archaeologists have also found glass and ceramic examples. And while these ones were discovered right here at Pompeii, Others have been found across the Mediterranean, even as far away as France and Egypt. That's because trade was an important part of the Roman economy, and goods such as wine were transported all over the empire. But amphorae weren't just used for transporting wine. They would also use them to store and sell oil, perfume, and fish. In fact, some amphorae were even used as urns for burying the dead. But today, we're going to focus on the wine-related ones. Archaeologists have found over 600 of these at Pompeii. Each one has a unique stamp or embossed design on the front of it. These markings represent the name of the producer or where the wine came from. And speaking of these stamps, let me tell you about one of the most famous examples. Just a few weeks ago, another exciting discovery was made at Pompeii. This was an ancient wine shop that still had its stock of wine intact. These are 36 amphorae that were discovered in the cellar of the shop. The room was found near the Forum, the center of civic life in the city. So this was likely a popular spot for people to stop and grab a drink. Each of these amphorae has a stamp on the front of it that reads FVI, which stands for the first of Venus. These are just a few of the many examples that have been found with this stamp, indicating that this was likely a very popular brand of wine. The wine from Pompeii was in such high demand that producers would even put their names on the vessels themselves to help ensure that no one else tries to sell their wine. And it looks like this brand really took pride in their product. So now that we've talked about the vessels that they use to carry the wine, let us go back to this wine press and talk about why Pompeii was able to produce such high-quality products. You might have already guessed that it has to do with the soil. Pompeii sat at the base of Mount Vesuvius, and this turned out to be both a blessing and a curse. Mount Vesuvius is a volcano, and volcanoes are full of minerals. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, it covered the surrounding area in ash. This ash mixed with water and became a type of fertilizer that helped the plants grow. Even today, the soil around Vesuvius is considered to be some of the most fertile land in Italy. It's well known for its tomatoes and other food crops. This meant that the grapes grown in the region tasted great and had a lot of sugar in them, which is exactly what you want when you're making wine. And while Mount Vesuvius is responsible for the destruction of Pompeii, it also gave this region a competitive edge when it came to wine production. The Romans took over the small Italian town of Pompeii sometime in the 3rd century BC and gradually expanded it into a large city. To support that growth, they improved the infrastructure. One major project was the construction of good roads. In the Forum, we can see a raised road. It might seem strange to us because we are used to being at street level. But when you compare it to the Forum in Rome, we can see that it has a similar raised roadway. And the Romans built the roads in Pompeii first, so it is likely that they built the road to be at the same level as the Roman Forum. These roads were important for moving people and goods within the city and to other cities. All throughout the empire, the paved roads connected cities, towns, and villages. These roads had been constructed around the Mediterranean by the Carthaginians and then the Greeks before the Romans came along. But the Romans really developed the idea of a road system that covered their whole empire. When the Romans took over an area, they would usually improve the existing road. They might widen it or pave it with stone. Roads were a high priority for them since trade and communication depended on them. These roads were not easy to build. Before laying the stones, they had to clear away the top layer of soil and lay a foundation. That foundation consisted of several layers. First, they laid a base layer of large stones. Then they filled in the gaps between those stones with smaller rocks, and finally they put a layer of small pebbles. This would form the base. Next, they added a layer of sand, then a layer of concrete. This was not the modern kind of concrete, but it was made from volcanic ash, which was very strong. On top of that, they put down bricks that had been baked in a kiln. And the Romans did not make these roads alone. They required labor from all free men in the empire. Every 5 years, they would have something called a census, where they would count the population and assess property. The results of the census determined taxes, but it also determined who would do public works, including road work. The main roads were about 24 feet wide, and the side roads were about 16 feet wide. There were even some really narrow roads. The streets were straight, and they intersected each other at right angles. The Romans believed that this type of grid pattern made the city easier to navigate and to defend. And they often planted trees along the roads to help shade travelers from the hot sun. I already mentioned aqueducts, and we will talk more about them later in this program. For now, I just want to show you the remains of the Porta Stabiana and the aqueduct that brought fresh water into the city. The Romans needed fresh water for drinking and for use in their baths and their plumbing systems. The nearby town of Stabia was famous for its baths, and the pipes that brought water there were made of bronze. When the water arrived in Pompeii, it went through the Porta Stabiana or Stabia Gate. This gate is one of the best preserved of the 7 gates that once protected the city. The gate was 27 feet tall and was made of stone. It had 2 large semicircular arches, and there were rooms above the arches. On the right side of the gate is an inscription that reads, "The colony of Pompeii to the deified Claudius Augustus and the divine Julia Drusilla." This means that this gate was built to honor the Emperor Claudius and his wife Julia Drusilla. Now let's look at the aqueduct. Aqueducts were structures that were used to carry water over valleys and hills. The aqueduct from Stabia entered Pompeii through the Porta Stabia, passing along the northeast corner of the city wall. Then it split into 3 different branches, heading north, south, and east. The aqueduct branch that headed north passed through the Forum and crossed under the Temple of Apollo before arriving at the baths of the Forum. The southern branch passed by the amphitheater and continued towards the eastern and western neighborhoods. And the third branch headed towards the southwest corner of the city. It is here where we find the most impressive part of the aqueduct. Here the aqueduct had to cross a valley. To do that, they built an elevated structure that was made of concrete. This structure was 20 feet high and 58 feet long. The water flowed through the center pipe, and there were 2 rooms on either side. We don't know for sure what they were used for, but some archaeologists believe that the rooms may have been used as storage rooms for the water supply. Finally, the water was distributed throughout the city through lead pipes. They used lead because it was malleable, so they could bend it into different shapes. Those pipes carried water to fountains, public baths, private baths, gardens, and houses. Now let's look at the sewers. Just like we need fresh water, we also need a way to dispose of wastewater. The Romans understood that clean water and sanitation were necessary for public health. The sewers in Pompeii were constructed at the same time as the aqueducts during the 1st century BC. As we already discussed, the city was destroyed in the 1st century AD, so we know that the sewers worked for a few hundred years. The sewer system consisted of a series of underground tunnels. Some were built below the roads. Here we can see a large sewer tunnel under the road near the Temple of Apollo. In the distance is a manhole. These manholes allowed the citizens to access the sewer tunnels. They were usually built at the intersections of the roads, like here at the corner of Via del Sudario and Via di Nola. The sewers were designed to carry away water and human waste from the city. Rainwater also flowed into the sewers, so they helped with flooding. The wastewater was carried to the sewers from the houses through lead pipes. Here in the house of the Vetai, we can see where a lead pipe carried waste from the bathroom to the sewer. In many houses, the wastewater would first go to a cesspool before entering the sewer. This house had a large floor drain in the bathroom. The water would flow into the drain and then down a shaft. At the bottom of the shaft was a metal screen that caught solid objects. Underneath that screen was another opening that led to the sewer. The wastewater did not travel very far from the city. It was dumped into the river Sarno, which was about 2 miles from the city. The river was very wide, and the water from the sewers diluted the wastewater, so it did not contaminate the river enough to make it undrinkable. One thing that is strange about the sewers is that they were separate from the aqueducts. Most of the time the aqueducts carried water over the tops of the sewers. This was not always the case, though where they crossed under each other, they were perpendicular to each other. So here, the aqueduct travels from north to south, and the sewer travels from east to west. So the sewer system was an effective way to remove wastewater from the city, but it was not without its problems. During the excavations, archaeologists found a lot of broken pottery and other objects that had been used to plug up the sewers. People would put these objects in the sewers to keep the sewage from flowing. They were trying to divert the sewage to their neighbor's house. This shows us that the Romans had problems with their sewer system early on. It never really worked correctly. It's time to talk about education and literacy in Pompeii. So if you're ready, let's get into it. So first of all, why are we looking at education? Well, it's because that's what I'm interested in, but also because education is one of the ways that we can understand societies. It tells us about the values of that society, what they thought was important, and how they structured their community. And so, by understanding the educational system and literacy levels of a society, we gain a greater insight into that society. So, with that said, let's start with schools. In Pompeii, there were 2 main types of schools. There were private schools, which were taught by private tutors and would focus on the wealthy children of Pompeii. And then there were public schools, which anyone could attend. Although there is some debate about whether or not girls were allowed in these public schools, most scholars believe that they were. Now, I'll probably spend more time talking about the public schools. But just to cover the private schools really quickly, these were taught by what's called a literator, a teacher, and usually happened in the teacher's home. The main subjects were reading, writing, and arithmetic. And there may have even been some Greek. We know that there were slaves who were sent to private tutors to learn to read and write, but it's not entirely clear how common this was. However, it does seem like it was fairly rare for lower-class people to go to private school, because it was expensive and they couldn't afford it. Now moving on to public education. So there were 4 public schools in Pompeii. 2 of them were for boys, and 2 of them were for girls. However, the school that we've found was for boys. It's located near the Forum, and we know that this is a school because we found slates, ink, and wax tablets used for writing. We've also found little pieces of wood where children would practice their writing, and nearby that school we found a public library. Now you might be wondering, well, what did they write on? Well, most likely they wrote on wax tablets. They would take a wooden tablet and cover it in wax, and then use a stylus to write on it. After they were done, they could scrape off the wax and start again. This was pretty expensive though, so it's possible that in poorer households, children would share tablets. Moving on from that, we need to ask ourselves, so who were these teachers? What was their role in society? Well, in Pompeii, they were freed slaves. That was a requirement. You had to be a freed slave to be a teacher. This is because only freed slaves had experience with writing. This is because in Roman society, slaves weren't allowed to learn to read or write, so they had to teach themselves. So when they were freed, they had the ability to read and write, so they became teachers. They were respected in society, but they weren't particularly well paid. We can tell that these teachers were former slaves because we found gravestones of teachers that say on them, and this is translated, "Here lies the freed man so-and-so, son of so-and-so." One thing that the teachers didn't do was teach morals. That was the parents' job. The teachers were just supposed to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. We know this because one papyrus that was found in Herculaneum, another city near Pompeii, was a letter from a father to a son's teacher, and in it he says, "I want you to teach him numbers, letters, how to read and write, but you are not to say a word about music or about morals, for I myself will see to these." In terms of how literacy worked, it seems like only the first 3 letters of the alphabet were needed to be written in full. So A, B, C, and then, after that, abbreviations were used. So it would be a bit like saying M for Mary, W for William. This is what most people did once they learned to read. But if you wanted to be able to write books, you needed to know the whole alphabet. And so you would need to go to someone like a freed slave who had taught themselves to read and write. We know this because one papyrus found in Pompeii was a sort of Reader's Digest, if you like, and it seemed to be designed to help people who hadn't had much schooling. So it would have helped them move from knowing just the basics of reading to being able to read more fluently. It wasn't just formal education either. Even graffiti tells us about education in Pompeii. For example, there's graffiti in the public bathrooms that helps us learn our alphabet. Basically, they're just the alphabet written over and over again so people can practice their writing. There's also some graffiti in Pompeii that's basically a Roman version of hopscotch. So there's a grid drawn out, and then within that grid, there's letters. And so players would probably have to recite a poem or something like that while they're playing. And this tells us that even those who weren't necessarily in school still knew their letters. One of the interesting things about the school that we found in Pompeii is that it's got these 2 big frescoes on the walls. One of them shows the 9 muses. The muses were basically goddesses of literature, science, and the arts. And so having them on the wall would have reminded students to work hard. The other fresco is the alphabet. It's the 24 letters of the alphabet, and it even includes the Greek letters. If we look closely, we can see that the letters aren't exactly accurate. So this tells us that maybe this school was teaching Greek as well. Another piece of graffiti that we find in Pompeii is basically a quiz, if you like, written on a wall. It's basically questions, multiple choice questions, and it asks you to figure out whether the noun is singular or plural. So basically, is book singular or plural? And then it gives you options. And if you were a student walking past, you could test yourself. Or maybe the teacher put it up there to help the students practice. Either way, it helps us learn about the sort of education that was happening in Pompeii. We also find these little wax tablets in the ash, and they're covered in writing, and it seems like they were dropped as people fled the city. These help us learn about education because they were probably used in school. So we can learn about the sort of lessons that were happening by seeing what was written on these tablets. Finally, we need to talk about the atrium. The atrium was this open space surrounded by columns, and it's interesting because we find these markings in the atrium floor, and they were used for teaching children to read and write. This is called a Roman abjad, and it has the letters marked out on the floor, and the teacher would point to each letter as they were saying it, and so this would help the children to remember the letters. We know that this is what they were used for because one of them was found next to a school. Also, there was a similar device that was found in Herculaneum, and a papyrus was found next to it, and on that papyrus was the alphabet. And so this tells us that this was what it was used for. There's also a few little details that I want to mention before I end this video. First of all, this statue of a chained woman was found in Pompeii, and she's chained to an altar, and she represents the goddess of literature and poetry. Her name is either Urania or Calliope. She was found in the public library in Pompeii. The other detail I want to talk about is this statue of a man that was found in the school. He's holding a scroll, and he is clearly a teacher. And this tells us that these statues weren't just used in temples, they were used in everyday life as well. When we think about ancient Rome, we often think about violence and war and politics, but this isn't the whole story. There was more to Roman life than just politics and war. People went to school and they learned to read and write. They played games and they practiced their religion. I hope that I've shown you that today. Ancient Rome wasn't just about politics and war. There was more to life then than that. Italy, 79 AD, a slight rumbling noise can be heard from Vesuvius. The locals of Pompeii hardly take notice. It's been rumbling for days. It's nothing new. Life goes on in the city just outside the volcano. People go about their daily activities. They have no idea that in a few hours' time their whole world will change forever. The local farmer, Gaius Pliny, better known as Pliny the Younger, is in the middle of his work when the earth begins to tremble. He stops to watch as a massive ash cloud rises into the sky. He doesn't see the destructive power coming his way. But he does know one thing. He must get out of there fast if he wants to survive. About 17 miles away, the Roman poet and philosopher Pliny the Elder feels the ground shake beneath his feet. The older Pliny also knows he must flee, but he wants to help others first. So he turns back to the city and sails toward the harbor. His fleet of ships are anchored there. He intends to rescue as many people as possible and then leave, but it's too late. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius has begun. Today, more than 2,000 years later, we know what happened next. We know that entire cities were buried under tons of ash and pumice. We know that thousands of people lost their lives. And we know that the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was one of the most devastating events in ancient history. But when I think of this event, I don't only think of the destruction, the loss of life, or the disaster. I think of something else. When I think of the eruption of Vesuvius, I think of the natural environment of the inhabitants of Pompeii. I think of how they lived in harmony with Vesuvius and the surrounding landscape, and I think of how suddenly everything was destroyed. The relationship between the people and the landscape is already evident in the name of the region in which Pompeii was located. Campia refers to the flat fields around Pompeii, an area created by the fertile volcanic soil of Vesuvius. This soil made it possible to grow crops such as wheat, vegetables, and fruit, and these crops supplied the city with food. The people of Pompeii were closely connected to the land. Many of them owned vineyards and small farms. Some even had their own olive groves and fish farms in the sea. In addition, the people of Pompeii used the hot springs in the nearby mountains for healing purposes. These springs were a source of wealth for the city, and the wealthy citizens even built their own private baths. But perhaps the greatest wealth of the natural environment was the sea. The coast near Pompeii was dotted with small fishing villages, where fishermen went out every day to catch fish and other seafood. Seafood was a luxury food for the inhabitants of Pompeii. The sea was also an important means of communication, bringing merchants and traders from all over the Mediterranean to the city. The harbor of Pompeii was one of the busiest in the entire Roman Empire. And then there was Vesuvius itself. The inhabitants of Pompeii saw the volcano not as a dangerous monster, but as a benevolent giant who gave them fertile soil and protected them from invaders. The mild climate of Campania, the fertile soil, the hot springs, the plentiful seafood, and the busy harbor made the natural environment of Pompeii unique. It was a blessing for the city and its inhabitants. It's hard to imagine that anyone could ever leave a place like this, and yet many Romans did. For example, there were the rich landowners who sold their estates and moved to Rome. They wanted to be part of the action, to experience the cultural and intellectual life of the great city firsthand. Then there were the slaves, who were forced to work in the mines or on the plantations of the rich. Finally, there were those who simply couldn't make ends meet in Pompeii and had to look for work elsewhere. In fact, the eruption of Vesuvius was not the first major catastrophe to befall the city. In 62 AD, an earthquake had already caused severe damage. Many residents left the city after that, never to return. But now, less than 20 years later, another disaster struck. The eruption of Vesuvius wiped Pompeii off the face of the earth. Entire families were buried under tons of ash and pumice. Their houses collapsed, their vineyards burned down, and their fields turned to desert. Only a few managed to escape the wrath of the volcano. But let's take a step back and look at the eruption itself. What really happened? Why was the destruction so great? To answer that question, we need to travel back to the beginning. Vesuvius is a stratovolcano, also called a composite volcano. Stratovolcanoes are known for their steep conical shape and their highly explosive eruptions. Vesuvius began its existence 40,000 years ago with minor eruptions. Over the centuries, it grew larger and larger, layer upon layer of ash and lava. In the Middle Pleistocene epoch, about 350,000 years ago, the volcano experienced its first major eruption. This was followed by a period of calm, but then came the Antonian eruption in the 1st century AD. This eruption led to the destruction of the Roman city of Herculaneum and the founding of the modern city of Naples. After that, Vesuvius fell silent again until the eruption of 79 AD. This eruption completely changed the landscape around Pompeii. Entire mountain ranges were formed by the force of the explosion. Hot clouds of gas and ash swept across the surrounding area, reaching temperatures of up to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. But that was not the end of it. Several cubic miles of pumice and ash were ejected during the eruption. The pumice formed light-colored pumice fields. The ash covered vast areas around Vesuvius, turning day into night. But the most destructive force of the eruption was the pyroclastic flow. Pyroclastic flow is a mixture of hot gas and solid matter that flows down the slopes of a volcano. These flows can reach speeds of up to 400 miles per hour. They are one of the most dangerous phenomena of volcanic eruptions. In the case of Pompeii, the pyroclastic flows completely buried the city. They carried away entire houses, vineyards, and people. Nothing could withstand their force. Everything was destroyed. Some historians believe that the eruption of Vesuvius was one of the largest events in human history. Others say it wasn't that great. Sure, it was bad for the people who lived nearby, but there were much bigger eruptions before and after it. I see it differently. It's not the size of the eruption that matters, but what it does to the people affected by it. When Vesuvius erupted, it didn't just destroy a city. It destroyed a way of life. It destroyed a relationship that had developed over centuries between humans and their environment. When I stand today on the site of the former city and look at the excavations, I don't see just ruins. I see a city that once thrived. I see a city that was part of the Roman Empire, yes, but also a city that was part of the natural environment. The eruption of Vesuvius is often referred to as the worst disaster in human history. And yes, it was a terrible tragedy. Thousands of people lost their lives. An entire city was buried under tons of debris. But it was also a turning point in human history. We learned how to record the history of our planet and its inhabitants more precisely. We learned how to study volcanoes and predict their behavior. And we learned how fragile human life is. What do you think? What would you like to visit, Pompeii or Herculaneum? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. Take care and see you next time.